If you enjoy my channel, please give me a like, subscribe, and share this video. Thank you so much.
A rainy bus stop. Have you ever smiled at someone even when you were terrified they might not understand a single word you said? Because deep down you were far more afraid of being alone than of speaking bad English? That was exactly how my life in America started, and honestly, if you had seen me that winter evening in Seattle, standing under a broken bus stop roof while cold rain soaked my cheap jacket from Walmart, you probably would have thought I was seconds away from crying or booking the next flight home. The strange thing is that nobody prepares you for how quiet loneliness sounds in another language. People talk about the American dream like it's a shiny movie trailer with fast music and dramatic sunsets. But nobody mentions eating instant noodles in a tiny apartment while listening to your upstairs neighbor vacuum at midnight because that's the only human sound in your life. My English was not terrible. Technically, I could order coffee. I could say have a nice day. I could understand maybe 70% of Netflix if subtitles were turned on and nobody spoke with a Texas accent. But real conversation? Real human connection? That felt like trying to dance while your brain was buffering every 5 seconds. Neuroscience actually explains this pretty well. Studies about second language anxiety show that when people fear making mistakes in English, the brain activates stress responses similar to social rejection. Basically, your nervous system treats bad grammar like you accidentally walked naked into a supermarket. Which is dramatic, but honestly accurate. That rainy evening, I had just finished a long shift cleaning tables at a small seafood restaurant near Pike Place Market. My feet hurt. My manager had corrected my pronunciation of salmon 3 times in one day. Apparently Americans do not pronounce the L. Wonderful. An entire letter exists only to emotionally manipulate immigrants. I remember staring at the wet streetlights reflecting on the pavement and thinking maybe I was simply too tired to become the confident English-speaking version of myself I imagined before moving to the United States. Then I heard a voice beside me say, "This rain feels personal today." I turned and saw a tall man holding 2 paper cups of coffee like he had prepared for emotional damage in advance. He smiled awkwardly. Not movie star awkward. Real awkward. Human awkward. The kind that instantly makes your shoulders relax because now both people are uncomfortable together. I laughed quietly and answered, "Maybe Seattle hates us equally." My grammar was simple. My accent was heavy. But he laughed like I had delivered the funniest line in America. That surprised me more than the rain. His name was Daniel. He worked at a bookstore nearby and admitted almost immediately that he spoke only English and barely even correctly. That sentence changed something inside my brain. Because for months I had treated English like a giant exam I was constantly failing. While this man treated communication like throwing little bridges toward another person and hoping one of them landed. There is actually a psychological reason why simple conversations often create stronger emotional bonds than perfect speeches. Researchers call it the processing fluency effect. When language is simple and emotionally direct, the brain spends less energy decoding and more energy feeling. In other words, connection matters more than performance. Unfortunately, nobody tells language learners that while they are busy apologizing for their accent. Daniel sat beside me at the bus stop while rain hammered the roof like someone angrily typing on a keyboard. We talked slowly. Very slowly. Sometimes I paused because my brain forgot vocabulary halfway through a sentence. Sometimes he paused because he was trying to understand my pronunciation of certain words. At one point I accidentally said, "I am boring in America," instead of "I am bored in America." He nearly spit out his coffee laughing, and honestly, so did I. That became the first moment in months when English stopped feeling like a prison and started feeling like a living thing. Messy. Funny. Human. We kept talking while 3 buses came and went because neither of us noticed the time. I told him I missed hot weather and loud family dinners. He told me Seattle people secretly use coffee as therapy. I told him Americans smile too much at strangers. He said immigrants are usually braver than Americans because they rebuild their entire lives from zero. That sentence stayed in my head all night. Because courage does not always look loud. Sometimes courage looks like answering a question in broken English when your heart is beating like a drum solo. Sometimes courage is showing up again after embarrassment. Sometimes courage is staying in a country where even buying shampoo feels like an advanced language test. People watching this video right now probably know that feeling. Maybe you replay English videos again and again because native speakers sound impossibly fast. Maybe you are scared of speaking because someone once laughed at your pronunciation. Maybe you think you need perfect grammar before anyone will truly listen to you. But here is the strange truth I learned that night in Seattle: most people are not waiting for perfection. They are waiting for sincerity. Human brains are deeply wired for emotional tone, facial expression, rhythm, warmth. Communication is much bigger than vocabulary lists. Babies connect with their mothers before understanding language. Couples understand each other through silence. Friends laugh before sentences are finished. Perfection is not the entry ticket for human connection. Presence is. Daniel eventually asked if I wanted to walk with him because the buses were delayed anyway. Rain still fell hard enough to blur the city lights into watercolor streaks. My shoes were soaked. My hair looked tragic. My English remained extremely imperfect. Yet for the first time since arriving in America, I did not feel invisible. And the funny part is that nothing magical happened. No dramatic movie soundtrack. No perfect romantic speech. Just two tired people walking slowly through cold Seattle rain while speaking simple English one small sentence at a time. Sometimes healing begins exactly there. Not in confidence. Not in perfection. Just in finally realizing another person is willing to meet you halfway, even when your words arrive clumsy and incomplete. Honestly, that night changed the entire direction of my life, although I did not know it yet. Because the hardest part of learning English was never grammar. It was believing I still deserved love, friendship, and connection while learning it. And trust me, the next thing Daniel said to me before we crossed the street made my heart completely panic for reasons I absolutely did not expect. Coffee with broken English. The dangerous thing about loneliness is that the moment someone makes you feel seen again, your heart immediately starts acting like a confused golden retriever running across a highway with zero survival instincts. That was basically me after Daniel looked at me in the middle of the rainy Seattle sidewalk and said, "You know, talking to you feels easy." Easy. That word almost broke my brain. Because nothing about my English felt easy. I still translated sentences inside my head before speaking. I still practiced conversations in the shower like a mentally unstable actress preparing for an audition nobody requested. I still panicked every time an American cashier asked unexpected questions like paper or plastic. Because suddenly it felt like I was taking the SAT exam while holding avocados. Yet somehow this man looked genuinely relaxed talking to me. We walked together for nearly 40 minutes that night while the cold air turned our hands red and buses hissed through wet streets beside us. Seattle smelled like coffee, rain, and emotional damage. Very cinematic. Daniel asked where I was from, but unlike many people, he did not immediately interrupt with stereotypes or geography confusion. He listened carefully. Slowly. Patiently. If you have ever struggled with English in another country, you know how rare that feels. Some people listen to understand you. Others listen like airport security searching for mistakes. Huge difference. We stopped outside a tiny late-night cafe with warm yellow lights glowing through fogged windows. The place looked like every independent coffee shop in America designed by someone who owns 17 sweaters and unresolved feelings. Daniel held the door open and asked if I wanted coffee. Normally, I would have said no because I was trying to save money. My apartment fridge contained eggs, ketchup, and emotional resilience. But something about that night felt important in a way I could not explain yet. Inside, soft jazz music floated through the cafe while exhausted students typed essays and couples whispered across wooden tables. I became immediately nervous again because cafes in America are dangerous for language learners. The menus have words like macchiato, drizzle, and half-caf oat milk vanilla cold brew, which honestly sounds less like coffee and more like a wizard spell. Daniel noticed my panic before I even spoke. "I'll order first," he whispered gently. That tiny sentence relaxed my nervous system more than therapy probably could. Psychologists call this co-regulation. When another calm person helps reduce your anxiety through tone, patience, and presence. Human beings are emotionally contagious. One nervous brain can infect a room. One calm voice can rescue it. We found seats near the window while rain rolled down the glass in silver lines. Daniel asked me what I found hardest about living in America. Not the fake polite version people ask while already planning their next sentence. A real question. So I answered honestly. I told him the hardest part was feeling intelligent in my own language but childish in English. That sentence became very quiet between us. Because if you know, you know. Language changes your personality. In your native language, maybe you are funny, clever, confident, sarcastic, warm. Then suddenly in English you become a confused potato searching for vocabulary while accidentally ordering iced tea instead of chicken soup. Research on bilingual identity actually shows that people often feel emotionally reduced when speaking a weaker language. It is not because they are less intelligent. The brain simply has fewer emotional shortcuts available. Imagine trying to paint your personality using only 6 crayons instead of 64. Daniel stirred his coffee slowly before saying something I still remember word for word years later. Maybe people are not falling in love with perfect sentences anyway. That line hit harder than caffeine. Because for months I had secretly believed nobody could fully know me until my English became flawless. As if grammar were some magical gate protecting love, friendship, belonging, opportunity, happiness. But sitting there watching rain blur the Seattle streets outside, I realized something uncomfortable. Native speakers say awkward things constantly. Americans forget words all the time. Couples misunderstand each other even in the same language. Communication has always been messy. Humans just pretend otherwise because confidence sounds impressive. Then came the embarrassing moment that nearly made me disappear under the table forever. Daniel asked what kind of movies I liked, and I wanted to say romantic dramas. Instead, because my exhausted brain betrayed me like an unpaid intern, I accidentally said romantic trauma. He stared at me for 2 seconds before laughing so hard he nearly dropped his coffee. I laughed too, partly because it was funny and partly because my soul had already left my body. But then something strange happened. Instead of feeling ashamed, I felt lighter. That tiny mistake created more connection than a perfect answer would have. Scientists studying social bonding actually found that small imperfections often increase likability. It is called the pratfall effect. When people appear slightly imperfect but genuine, others trust them more. Basically, your awkward moments might be doing more emotional work than your polished ones. Incredible news for humanity, honestly. Over the next few weeks, Daniel and I kept meeting at that cafe after my restaurant shifts. Sometimes we practiced English together. Sometimes we simply talked slowly about life. He explained American habits that confused me. I explained why immigrants often smile politely even when overwhelmed. We built conversations sentence by sentence like two people assembling furniture without instructions. Some nights my grammar collapsed entirely after long work hours. Some nights his jokes made no sense to me because American humor occasionally sounds like sleep deprivation with background music. But every conversation became easier. Not because my English suddenly became perfect, but because fear slowly stopped sitting at the table with us. That matters more than people realize. Neuroscience shows the brain learns language faster in emotionally safe environments. Anxiety literally interferes with memory formation and speech processing. In simple words, your brain studies better when it stops believing mistakes equal humiliation. Daniel somehow understood this naturally. He never corrected me in a cruel way. Instead, he repeated phrases gently during conversation until my brain absorbed them automatically. No pressure. No classroom tension. Just real human interaction. One evening he taught me the phrase "take your time." I laughed because Americans say it constantly, yet nobody actually means it in fast food restaurants. But Daniel did mean it. And maybe that became the real reason I started falling for him. Not because he was perfect. Not because Seattle rain suddenly became romantic. But because for the first time since arriving in America, I felt safe enough to speak slowly without apologizing for existing. Still, life has a twisted sense of humor. Just when I started believing maybe this connection could become something deeper. One humiliating moment inside that cafe changed everything between us in a way I absolutely did not see coming. Cold weather, warm hearts. Nobody warns you that moving to America can make you feel like an alien pretending to be a functional adult while secretly Googling things native-born. People learned at age 12, and honestly, the first winter I spent in Seattle felt less like a romantic life chapter and more like a survival documentary narrated by anxiety. The rain never seemed to stop. Not dramatic tropical rain. Not cinematic thunderstorm rain. Just endless gray drizzle falling from the sky like the universe itself had low motivation. Even the sunlight looked tired. I remember waking up one morning in my tiny apartment and realizing I had not seen blue sky in nearly 2 weeks. My body felt strange. Heavy. Slow. Scientists actually explain this with seasonal affective disorder and reduced serotonin levels during darker months. Which is a fancy way of saying your brain becomes emotionally sponsored by cloudy weather. Meanwhile, back home, my family sent photos wearing t-shirts under bright sunshine while I walked through Seattle wrapped in 3 sweaters looking like a depressed burrito. Yet somehow, during that freezing season, Daniel became the warmest thing in my life. We continued meeting almost every evening after work. Sometimes at the cafe. Sometimes walking beside the waterfront while cold wind attacked us personally. Sometimes inside bookstores where old paper smelled comforting in a way modern life never does. But there was still one problem sitting quietly between us every single day. I was terrified he would eventually realize how exhausting it was to communicate with me. People learning English rarely admit this out loud, but many conversations feel like mental CrossFit. Your brain searches for vocabulary, translates grammar, listens carefully, analyzes pronunciation, manages embarrassment. and tries not to accidentally say something horrifying. All at the same time. By the end of the day, I often felt mentally cooked. Meanwhile, Americans somehow speak while chewing gum, driving, texting, and emotionally oversharing simultaneously. Incredible species. One evening, Daniel invited me to a small Christmas market downtown. I almost said no immediately. Not because I did not want to go, but because group situations in English terrified me. One-on-one conversations were manageable. Crowds were different. Too many accents. Too much noise. Too many chances to misunderstand something and accidentally respond like a malfunctioning robot. But Daniel smiled and said, "Come on. Worst case, we both get embarrassed together." That sentence should honestly be printed on relationship advice posters everywhere. We arrived at the market just after sunset. Lights wrapped around trees like glowing ribbons while people carried hot chocolate through the cold air. Music floated between wooden stalls selling handmade candles, scarves, cookies, and things nobody actually needs but suddenly desperately wants during winter. America becomes emotionally dangerous around Christmas. Even grocery stores start looking like inspirational movies. I remember standing there completely overwhelmed by the noise and movement while my brain tried desperately to process every conversation around me. Fast English feels different in public spaces. Words bounce everywhere. People interrupt each other. Slang appears from nowhere like surprise boss battles in a video game. Daniel noticed my expression immediately. "You okay?" he asked softly. I nodded automatically, the universal immigrant response for "absolutely not, but thank you." Then came the moment that changed everything. We stopped at a food stand selling clam chowder. The older woman taking orders spoke incredibly fast, and I froze halfway through answering her question about toppings. Total mental shutdown. My brain suddenly forgot every English word except maybe banana. The woman repeated herself louder, which somehow makes understanding even harder. Panic started climbing into my chest. If you have experienced language anxiety before, you know this feeling exactly. Your hearing becomes blurry. Your thoughts speed up. The pressure to respond correctly grows enormous. Research in cognitive psychology shows stress can temporarily reduce working memory capacity during second language conversations. In simple words, fear makes your brain unplug itself at the worst possible moment. I stood there staring like a broken GPS while people waited behind us. Then Daniel stepped closer and calmly repeated the woman's question slowly into my ear. She asked if you want bread. Bread. Just bread. Incredible. My brain had collapsed over bread. I laughed so suddenly I nearly embarrassed myself again. Daniel laughed too, not at me, but with me. That distinction matters more than people realize. Mockery creates shame. Shared laughter creates safety. We carried our food to a quiet bench overlooking the water while ferries moved through the dark harbor lights. Cold air stung my cheeks. Steam rose from our soup cups. Seattle looked beautiful in that lonely winter way cities sometimes do when everyone secretly needs comfort. I admitted to Daniel that public conversations still scared me. Sometimes I feel stupid, I whispered. He looked genuinely confused by that sentence. You moved across the world by yourself, he said. Most people are too scared to change shampoo brands. I laughed so hard soup almost came out of my nose, which honestly would have ended the romance immediately. But his point stayed with me. Language learners often confuse temporary difficulty with permanent weakness. Huge mistake. The human brain is literally rewiring itself while learning another language. Neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. Every awkward conversation, every embarrassing mistake, every slow sentence is actually physical evidence of your brain building new pathways. Which means struggling does not prove failure. It proves growth is happening in real time. Unfortunately, growth rarely feels inspirational while it is occurring. Usually it feels like confusion mixed with caffeine. Daniel started teaching me small conversational tricks after that night. Not grammar rules from textbooks. Real-life survival English. He explained that Americans often care more about confidence and friendliness than perfect pronunciation. He showed me simple phrases people use constantly in casual conversation. No worries. Sounds good. I get you. Tiny expressions that somehow make interactions feel natural. Slowly, I stopped trying to sound impressive and started trying to sound present. That shift changed everything. One snowy evening, while we walked through Capitol Hill wrapped in scarves and carrying grocery bags, Daniel suddenly asked if I had ever planned to stay permanently in America. The question hit me harder than expected. Because the truth was complicated. Part of me still felt temporary, like a visitor emotionally camping inside someone else's culture. Immigrants often experience this strange psychological split. Your body lives in one country while your identity floats somewhere between old memories and new habits. You become both homesick and changed at the same time. Very confusing experience. I looked at Daniel carefully before answering. I don't know yet, I admitted quietly. He nodded slowly, then said something that made my heartbeat completely betray me. I hope you stay. Just 4 simple words. No dramatic speech. No movie soundtrack. Yet suddenly the freezing Seattle air no longer felt cold at all. And honestly, that should have been the moment I realized my life was about to become far more complicated than learning English ever was. Because a few days later, Daniel invited me to meet someone who would either completely accept me, or unintentionally destroy every bit of confidence I had painfully rebuilt inside myself. Small words, big feelings. There is a special kind of panic that only happens when someone you secretly care about says, I want you to meet my friends. Because suddenly your brain stops thinking about romance and starts preparing for public humiliation like it is training for the Olympics. That was me the entire week after Daniel invited me to a small dinner party at his friend's apartment in Seattle. I smiled when he asked. I even said, sure, sounds fun, in calm English like a mentally stable person. Meanwhile inside my head, every neuron was screaming. Meeting one American man was already emotionally exhausting enough. Meeting multiple fast-talking Americans in the same room felt like voluntarily entering a language battlefield armed only with fear and polite smiles. I spent 3 days preparing conversation topics like I was studying for an exam designed by extroverts. Weather, food, travel, music, safe topics, harmless topics. Topics unlikely to destroy my confidence in under 5 minutes. What nobody tells language learners is that social anxiety becomes much worse when your vocabulary cannot fully protect your personality. In your native language, you can recover from awkward moments quickly. You can joke, explain, clarify. In a second language, every silence feels larger. Every misunderstanding feels permanent. Psychologists call this self-presentation anxiety. Your brain becomes obsessed with controlling how others perceive you because communication suddenly feels fragile. Basically, your nervous system transforms casual dinner conversations into survival missions. The night of the party, Seattle rain tapped softly against apartment windows while I stood in front of my mirror changing clothes 5 separate times. I finally chose a simple dark sweater because it made me look slightly less terrified. Daniel arrived carrying flowers and wearing that relaxed smile that somehow always lowered my heart rate by 20%. "You look beautiful," he said immediately. I answered thank you while my brain replayed the sentence for the next 12 business days. On the drive there, I confessed quietly that I was nervous. Daniel glanced at me and laughed softly. "You know what my friends care about most?" he asked. "If you're kind." That sounded lovely in theory. Unfortunately, my anxious brain remained convinced they were secretly hosting an advanced English listening competition disguised as dinner. The apartment smelled like garlic bread, candles, and expensive furniture decisions. People laughed loudly from inside before the door even opened. Then came the sensory overload. Music. Fast conversations. American humor flying across the room like tennis balls launched directly at my forehead. Everyone smiled warmly, but my brain still struggled to keep up. One woman hugged me immediately. Americans truly treat personal space like an optional suggestion sometimes. Her name was Emily. She spoke quickly but kindly, asking where I was from and how long I had lived in Seattle. I answered slowly, carefully organizing words inside my head before speaking them. The strange thing about conversations in another language is that your body often reacts before your mind does. My shoulders tightened automatically. My hands felt cold. I smiled constantly because nervous immigrants often use smiling as emotional camouflage. Scientists studying cross-cultural communication actually found that people speaking a weaker language often experience increased cortisol levels during group interactions. In simple words, your body thinks social conversations are bear attacks. Very helpful biological design. We sat around a long dining table while rain blurred the city lights outside. Everyone talked easily, interrupting each other naturally in that very American way where conversations somehow remain chaotic yet friendly. I tried desperately to follow along. Some jokes landed perfectly. Others flew past me at the speed of emotional confusion. At one point someone mentioned filing taxes, and the entire table groaned dramatically like they were discussing ancient torture methods. Honestly, after seeing American paperwork, I understood completely. Then something unexpected happened. Emily asked me how I learned English. The table became quieter. Suddenly everyone was listening directly to me. My heart started punching my ribs like it wanted immediate escape. I could have given a short, safe answer. But instead, maybe because Daniel looked at me so calmly, I told the truth. I explained how lonely my first months in America had been. How I practiced English by watching YouTube videos slowly with subtitles. How I repeated phrases while cooking dinner alone in my apartment. How exhausting it felt trying to become a new version of myself every single day. My grammar was imperfect. I paused often searching for vocabulary. But nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. People listened carefully. Really listened. There is something fascinating researchers discovered about emotional communication. Vulnerability often matters more than linguistic complexity. Human brains respond strongly to sincerity because emotional honesty activates empathy networks far more deeply than polished language alone. In simple words, people remember how you make them feel long after they forget your grammar mistakes. Emily suddenly smiled and admitted she only speaks English and barely survived one semester of Spanish in high school. Everyone laughed. Then another friend confessed he once accidentally insulted a waiter in Italy because of bad pronunciation. Another described crying while studying abroad in Japan because she could not explain herself clearly. Suddenly the room changed. I was no longer the girl with broken English. I was simply another human being trying to connect in a complicated world. That realization felt strangely powerful. Then came the moment I still think about years later. Daniel's friend Marcus asked how we met. Before I could answer, Daniel smiled and said, "At a bus stop during terrible Seattle weather. We basically bonded through mutual suffering." Everyone laughed again. Then he added casually, "Honestly, talking to her feels more real than most conversations I've had in years." The room became quiet for exactly 2 seconds, but inside my chest, it felt like time stopped completely. Nobody had ever described me that way before. Especially not in English. Especially not in America. I looked down immediately because eye contact suddenly felt dangerous. But something warm spread through me anyway. Not confidence exactly. More like permission. Permission to stop apologizing for my accent. Permission to believe connection could exist even when sentences arrived slowly. Permission to be loved while still unfinished. The rest of the night became easier after that. I laughed more naturally. I stopped translating every sentence before speaking. My English remained imperfect, of course. At one point I accidentally used the wrong tense and sounded like a confused time traveler. Incredible performance. But nobody cared. Because real conversations are not graded exams. They are emotional exchanges. Tiny bridges between nervous human beings pretending they know what they are doing. By the time Daniel drove me home, Seattle streets were shining from fresh rain while soft music played quietly in the car. I remember staring out the window thinking maybe this was the first time America actually felt less foreign. Not because my English had magically improved overnight. But because I had finally experienced something immigrants secretly crave more than fluency, belonging. Then Daniel parked outside my apartment, looked at me carefully in the dim streetlight, and asked a question so unexpected that my entire heartbeat completely lost its professionalism. The first family dinner. You can survive bad weather, culture shock, homesickness, and even American healthcare prices. But nothing truly prepares your nervous system for the moment the person you love says, "My parents want to meet you." Honestly, my soul nearly disconnected from my body when Daniel said those words while we sat inside our favorite Seattle cafe one quiet Sunday afternoon. Outside, rain slid down the windows in slow silver lines while people hurried through the cold carrying umbrellas that the wind clearly hated. Inside, warm coffee smells floated through the air, and my heartbeat immediately transformed into a drum concert sponsored by Panic. Meeting friends had already terrified me enough. Parents were an entirely different psychological horror movie. Because friends might judge your personality. Parents judge your future. My brain instantly started generating catastrophic scenarios like an overworked Netflix writer. What if they hated my accent? What if I misunderstood their questions? What if I accidentally offended someone because American family culture still confused me sometimes? In my country, refusing food politely can be normal. In America, refusing homemade pie from someone's mother can look like emotional warfare. Cultural differences are dangerous little landmines. Daniel noticed my expression immediately and laughed softly. "Relax," he said. "They already like you." That sentence did absolutely nothing for my anxiety. Human brains are fascinating that way. Psychologists explain that anxious people often reject reassurance because the brain treats uncertainty like a threat requiring constant preparation. In simple words, fear becomes emotionally addicted to worst-case scenarios. Very exhausting hobby. The dinner was planned for Friday evening at his parents' house outside Seattle. I spent the entire week overthinking every possible detail. I practiced introductions while brushing my teeth. I searched online for American family dinner etiquette at 2 in the morning like a sleep-deprived anthropologist. Apparently there are rules about bringing wine, helping clean dishes, and not discussing politics unless you enjoy emotional destruction. Wonderful. Friday finally arrived cold and gray, because Seattle apparently commits fully to its aesthetic. I wore a simple blue dress and spent 20 minutes deciding whether my accent sounded better when speaking slowly or naturally. Immigrants understand this strange mental battle. You become hyper-aware of your voice. Every word feels like it carries your entire identity across a dangerous bridge. Daniel picked me up after work holding flowers and smiling in that calm way that always made me feel slightly less ridiculous. "You're going to be okay," he whispered while driving through wet suburban streets lined with glowing porch lights and pine trees. My mom already made too much food. That's basically her love language. Honestly, food as emotional communication is something every culture understands perfectly. When we arrived, the house looked warm enough to heal seasonal depression immediately. Yellow light glowed through windows. Soft music floated from inside. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic hit me before the door even fully opened. Daniel's mother hugged him first, then turned toward me with kind eyes and an energy level powerful enough to reorganize furniture by accident. "We're so happy you're here," she said warmly. I smiled and thanked her while mentally reviewing basic English vocabulary like my life depended on it. His father shook my hand gently and welcomed me inside. Everything felt almost too normal, which somehow made me more nervous. Anxious brains distrust calmness. We sat around a large wooden table covered with candles, bread, vegetables, and enough food to survive a small apocalypse. American family dinners fascinated me because they looked relaxed on the surface yet secretly operated like social performance art. People passed dishes while discussing weather, work, childhood memories, random neighborhood gossip. Conversations overlapped naturally. Laughter appeared suddenly. Meanwhile, I sat there carefully translating sentences inside my head while trying not to look like a malfunctioning exchange student. At first things went surprisingly well. Daniel's mother asked gentle questions about my hometown, my job, and what surprised me most about living in America. I answered slowly but confidently. I even made a small joke about Seattle rain feeling emotionally personal, and everyone laughed. Tiny victory. Then his father asked what I missed most from home. Such a simple question. Yet suddenly my chest tightened unexpectedly. Because loneliness often hides quietly until someone asks the exact question your heart avoids. I paused before answering. Family dinners, I admitted softly. Back home, everything was louder. More crowded. More chaotic. I struggled to find the right word. Daniel looked at me patiently while I searched my brain for vocabulary like someone digging through messy kitchen drawers. Alive, I finally whispered. The table became quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet. Real listening quiet. Then Daniel's mother smiled gently and said something that nearly destroyed me emotionally right there beside the mashed potatoes. Well, she said softly, maybe our table can feel a little more alive now too. I swear my throat closed immediately after that sentence. There is something deeply emotional about being welcomed while feeling foreign. Neuroscientists studying belonging found that social acceptance activates reward systems in the brain almost like physical warmth. Humans are biologically wired for connection. Rejection hurts literally because the brain processes it similarly to physical pain. Which explains why kindness during vulnerable moments feels so overwhelming sometimes. The evening continued with stories, laughter, and occasional language confusion that somehow became funny instead of painful. At one point I accidentally misunderstood the phrase second helping and thought Daniel's mother was asking whether I wanted a second personality. Incredible achievement. Everyone laughed so hard his father nearly dropped his fork. Years earlier, a mistake like that would have humiliated me for weeks. But sitting there at that table, surrounded by warmth and candlelight and people genuinely trying to know me, embarrassment transformed into connection instead of shame. That shift changed everything inside me. Then came the moment I will never forget. After dinner, while Daniel helped wash dishes, his mother stayed beside me in the kitchen drying plates slowly. The house smelled like cinnamon pie and coffee. Soft jazz played quietly from another room. She suddenly asked, "Can I tell you something honestly?" My heart immediately prepared for disaster. But instead she smiled gently and said, "Daniel hasn't looked this happy in years." I froze completely. Because nobody had ever connected my existence to someone else's happiness before. Especially not in another country. Especially not in English. She continued quietly, "You don't have to speak perfectly here. You just have to be yourself." That sentence broke something open inside me emotionally. For so long, I had believed love required flawless communication. Perfect grammar. Perfect confidence. Perfect adaptation. But maybe real relationships were built differently. Maybe they survive through patience, sincerity, laughter, misunderstanding, forgiveness. Human things. Messy things. By the time Daniel drove me home that night, Seattle streets shimmered beneath cold rain while my reflection blurred softly in the car window. I felt strangely peaceful. Lighter somehow. Like part of my fear had quietly loosened its grip. Then Daniel parked outside my apartment, turned toward me carefully, and said 5 words that instantly changed the direction of our relationship forever. Why I wanted to quit. The most dangerous moments in life are usually very quiet, because people imagine giving up as some dramatic movie scene with tears, shouting, and emotional speeches, but honestly, the night I almost decided to stop trying in America looked painfully ordinary. It was a Tuesday. Rain hammered against my apartment windows like Seattle was personally offended by my existence. My socks were still wet from work. Half a frozen pizza sat untouched on the kitchen counter while I stared blankly at my laptop screen after failing to understand a simple work email. For nearly 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Over an email. That was the moment something inside me cracked. Not loudly. Just enough to make exhaustion feel heavier than hope. People watching this video right now probably know exactly what I mean. Sometimes learning English does not feel inspiring. Sometimes it feels humiliating, repetitive, lonely. You study vocabulary, practice pronunciation, watch videos, repeat phrases, smile politely through confusion, and somehow still freeze when someone speaks too fast at a grocery store. Your progress becomes invisible to you because your mistakes keep screaming louder than your improvement. Psychologists call this the negativity bias. Human brains naturally focus more intensely on failures than successes because survival systems evolved to notice threats first. Which means your brain will remember one embarrassing English mistake more clearly than 50 successful conversations. Very rude evolutionary design, honestly. That Tuesday had already been awful before the email incident. Earlier at the restaurant, a customer became impatient because I misunderstood his order twice. Then my manager corrected my pronunciation in front of coworkers again. Not cruelly. Just casually. But repeated embarrassment accumulates slowly inside people like water leaking into walls. At some point the structure starts weakening. By the time I returned home, I felt emotionally exhausted in a way sleep cannot fix. Daniel had texted asking if I wanted to meet for coffee later, but I ignored the message. Not because I was angry. Because shame makes people hide. That is one of the cruelest parts of insecurity. You start avoiding the very people who make life easier because you feel unworthy of being seen struggling again. I sat alone in my apartment listening to rain while memories from home drifted through my head like old songs. Family dinners. Fast conversations in my native language. The effortless version of myself I used to be. There is a strange grief immigrants rarely discuss openly. You mourn personalities you can no longer express fully. In your own language, maybe you were funny without trying. Confident. Sharp. Warm. Then suddenly in English you become quieter, slower, more cautious. Like your real self got trapped behind thick glass. Studies about bilingual identity actually show that language affects emotional expression deeply because memories, humor, and social confidence are often tied to native linguistic patterns. In simple words, learning another language can temporarily make you feel like a faded version of yourself. Around 9 that evening, my phone rang unexpectedly. Daniel. I almost ignored it. But loneliness and love are both stubborn things. Hey, he said softly after I answered. You disappeared. I forced a laugh. I'm just tired. There was a pause. Then he asked quietly, what happened? That question nearly ruined me emotionally because sometimes people ask, how are you casually? But occasionally someone asks it like they genuinely plan to stay for the answer. Huge difference. I tried explaining my day. The customer. The corrections. The email. My voice sounded smaller with every sentence. Finally, I whispered something I had secretly been thinking for months. Maybe I'm not meant to live here. Silence filled the phone for a second. Rain tapped against my windows. Somewhere outside, a car splashed through wet streets. Then Daniel said something so simple it almost annoyed me at first. Come downstairs. I blinked. What? I'm outside your apartment. Apparently this man had driven across Seattle at night because he sensed my emotional collapse through texting. Very inconveniently romantic behavior. I grabbed my jacket and walked downstairs looking absolutely tragic. Daniel stood under a streetlight holding 2 paper cups of hot chocolate because apparently he understood emotional emergencies professionally. We sat together inside his car while rain blurred the windshield into watercolor patterns. I stared at my drink quietly, embarrassed by how emotional I felt over something as stupid as language struggles. But Daniel looked at me carefully before saying, "You know what's weird?" I shrugged weakly. "You think your mistakes are the most important thing about you." That sentence hit me harder than expected. Because he was right. Somewhere along the way, I had started measuring my worth through fluency. Good English day? Valuable human. Bad English day? Embarrassing failure. Which is psychologically dangerous. Researchers studying self-worth found that people who tie identity too closely to performance often experience stronger anxiety and emotional burnout. Basically, when every conversation feels like a test, your nervous system never truly rests. Daniel continued softly, "Do you know what I notice when you speak?" I laughed bitterly. "Grammar disasters?" He smiled. "No. I notice courage." That word made my throat tighten unexpectedly. Courage. Nobody had ever used that word to describe my broken English before. Yet maybe he was right. Maybe speaking imperfectly every single day in a foreign country actually required enormous bravery. Most people never voluntarily place themselves in situations where they sound less intelligent than they really are. Immigrants do it constantly. Language learners do it constantly. That matters. We sat there talking for almost an hour while Seattle rain performed emotional background music around us. Daniel reminded me how far I had already come. Months earlier I struggled ordering coffee. Now I could hold conversations, joke with his friends, survive family dinners, explain feelings. Progress feels invisible when you stand too close to it. Human brains adapt quickly, which means yesterday's impossible achievement becomes today's normal expectation. That is why many learners feel stuck even while improving dramatically. Then Daniel asked me something strange. "Can I tell you what makes people connect with someone?" I nodded quietly. "Attention," he answered immediately. "Not perfection. Attention." He explained that most people are too distracted, insecure, or emotionally tired to care about flawless grammar. What they remember is warmth, listening, kindness, presence. And honestly, research supports this completely. Communication experts found that emotional responsiveness predicts relationship quality far more strongly than linguistic sophistication. In simple words, humans would rather feel understood imperfectly than ignored perfectly. Somewhere during that conversation, something inside me softened. Not magically. My English problems did not disappear overnight. I still made mistakes. I still felt anxious sometimes. But for the first time, I stopped viewing fluency as permission to deserve love or belonging. Maybe growth did not require becoming fearless. Maybe it simply required continuing despite fear. Before leaving, Daniel looked at me seriously and said, "Promise me something." I asked what. He smiled gently. "Don't quit 5 minutes before your life changes." That sentence stayed in my head all night after he drove away through rain-covered Seattle streets. Because deep down, part of me knew he was right. And strangely enough, the very next morning, something happened at work that would completely change the direction of both my English journey and our relationship forever. Children changed everything. Nobody tells you that becoming a parent in another language feels like trying to assemble your entire identity while sleep-deprived, emotionally unstable, and holding a tiny human who somehow controls the emotional climate of the entire house with one sneeze. Honestly, when I first found out I was pregnant, my brain reacted in two completely different directions at the same time. One part of me felt overwhelming happiness because Daniel and I had already built something beautiful together through years of awkward English. Rainy Seattle evenings, tiny apartments, cheap coffee, and emotional survival. But the other part of me immediately panicked over something nobody around me seemed to understand. How was I supposed to become a mother in English when I still sometimes felt insecure ordering sandwiches? It sounds ridiculous now, but fear is rarely logical. Pregnancy already changes the brain dramatically. Scientists discovered that hormone shifts during pregnancy increase emotional sensitivity and protective instincts, which is nature's way of preparing humans for parenting while simultaneously making them cry over grocery commercials. Add immigration stress and second language anxiety on top of that, and suddenly your nervous system starts behaving like an overworked airport security officer. During those months, every doctor appointment terrified me. Medical English is basically its own advanced survival game. Words like prenatal, contractions, epidural, and dilation floated around my head while I nodded politely, pretending my brain was not buffering like old Wi-Fi. Daniel always came with me, holding my hand during appointments and quietly translating complicated explanations into simpler English afterward. One afternoon, while sitting in a waiting room filled with exhausted pregnant women scrolling their phones like emotionally defeated penguins, I admitted something to him that I had never said out loud before. I'm scared our child will think I sound stupid. Even whispering the sentence hurt. Because deep down, many language learners secretly fear this. Not just embarrassment. Loss of authority. Loss of identity. Loss of connection with future children growing up more fluent than their parents. Daniel looked genuinely shocked by my words. Our child is going to hear your voice and think home, he answered immediately. I almost cried right there beside a brochure about breastfeeding. Neuroscience actually supports what he said. Babies form emotional attachment through tone, rhythm, facial expressions, and responsiveness long before understanding grammar. Love reaches children through presence, not perfect pronunciation. Still, fear remained stubborn. Then our daughter Lily was born during one cold Seattle morning while rain tapped softly against hospital windows because apparently even major life events in Seattle require atmospheric sadness. The moment I held her for the first time, everything inside me changed so suddenly it felt physical. Her tiny fingers wrapped around mine while her face looked angry about existing, which honestly seemed reasonable after birth. Daniel cried immediately. I cried too. The nurse probably cried. Everyone in that room emotionally collapsed within minutes. That first year after Lily's birth was beautiful chaos. Sleep disappeared completely. Conversations became fragmented survival messages exchanged between exhausted adults holding coffee like sacred medicine. But strangely, my relationship with English started changing too. Because babies do not care about accents. Babies do not judge grammar. Babies only care if your face lights up when they look at you. Every day I spoke simple English sentences to Lily while feeding her, rocking her, walking through Seattle parks wrapped in blankets against the cold air. Look at the rain. Mommy loves you. You're safe. Tiny phrases. Repeated constantly. Slowly, English stopped feeling like performance and started feeling like care. Researchers studying language acquisition discovered that emotional repetition helps the brain absorb language naturally because feelings strengthen memory pathways. In simple words, humans learn language faster when connected emotionally to what they are saying. That explains why textbook vocabulary disappears instantly while one loving sentence can stay inside you forever. One evening, when Lily was around 10 months old, something happened that completely shifted how I saw myself. Daniel had invited friends over for dinner. The apartment was noisy, crowded, warm. People laughed while Lily crawled dangerously toward furniture like a tiny drunk explorer. At one point she fell and started crying loudly. Instantly, without thinking, I picked her up and comforted her in English. Fast English. Natural English. Emotional English. No translating. No fear. No hesitation. It's okay, baby, mommy's here. Simple sentence. Yet the moment I said it, I realized something shocking. I had stopped being afraid of sounding imperfect when love mattered more than performance. Daniel noticed it too. Later that night, while washing dishes together, he smiled and said quietly, "You know your English sounds different now?" I immediately became suspicious. Different bad? He laughed. Different alive. That sentence stayed with me because he was right. Somewhere between pregnancy, exhaustion, diapers, midnight lullabies, and family life, I had unknowingly crossed an invisible emotional bridge. I stopped speaking English like a student asking permission and started speaking like a human being building a life. There is an important psychological shift that happens when people stop treating language as identity proof and start treating it as connection. Anxiety decreases. Fluency improves naturally. Confidence grows quietly instead of forcefully. The brain learns better when survival panic leaves the room. Unfortunately, most learners spend years trying to sound perfect before allowing themselves to participate emotionally. Huge mistake. Some of my happiest memories from those years were ridiculously ordinary. Taking Lily grocery shopping while she pointed at bananas like discovering ancient treasure. Watching Daniel teach her silly American songs, I barely understood myself. Cooking dinners while switching between languages without realizing it. Our apartment became noisy, messy, bilingual, emotional, chaotic. Beautiful. Of course, there were still difficult moments. Sometimes strangers complimented Lily's English while speaking slowly to me like I was her confused babysitter. Sometimes I worried she would grow embarrassed of my accent someday. Immigrant parents carry invisible fears constantly. But children often understand love more clearly than adults do. One rainy afternoon, when Lily was around 4 years old, she climbed onto my lap while I read her a bedtime story. Halfway through the book, I mispronounced a word accidentally. I froze automatically, waiting for correction or embarrassment. Instead, Lily touched my face gently and whispered, "Mommy, I like how you talk." That tiny sentence nearly broke me emotionally. Because children do not listen with judgment first. Adults learn that later. Children listen for warmth, safety, familiarity, home. That night after Lily fell asleep, I sat quietly beside the window watching Seattle rain blur city lights into soft colors while Daniel wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. "You okay?" he asked softly. I nodded slowly before admitting something strange. I think I spent years believing English was a wall between me and people. Daniel kissed my forehead gently. maybe it was always a bridge. And honestly, that should have been the peaceful turning point in our story. But life loves testing people exactly when they finally start feeling safe. Because not long after that conversation, one painful misunderstanding inside our marriage revealed that even love can become fragile when insecurity hides silently beneath everyday words. Funny mistakes in America. One of the strangest things about becoming more comfortable in English is realizing your worst language mistakes eventually turn into family stories. People laugh about during dinner instead of emotional disasters that keep you awake at 3 in the morning staring at the ceiling like a haunted Victorian widow. Honestly, if somebody had told me years earlier that my embarrassing English moments would someday become the funniest part of my marriage, I would have laughed directly into their face while crying internally. But life is weird like that. The human brain loves turning old pain into comedy once survival is no longer threatened. Psychologists actually explain humor as a coping mechanism that helps people emotionally reprocess stressful memories. In simple words, your nervous system eventually says, well, we didn't die from humiliation, so I guess this is content now. By the time Lily turned 5, our home had become a chaotic bilingual circus filled with toy dinosaurs, half-finished coffee mugs, and random conversations switching between languages so quickly even I sometimes forgot which country my brain belonged to. Daniel still worked at the bookstore. I had moved into a better restaurant position where I spoke English constantly with customers. My fluency improved naturally over time, but not in the glamorous movie way people imagine. Real language learning looks less like sudden transformation and more like accidentally realizing one day that you stopped mentally translating while arguing with customer service on the phone. Very romantic milestone. Yet even after years in America, my brain still occasionally betrayed me in spectacular ways. And unfortunately, America provides endless opportunities for public embarrassment because Americans love small talk more than oxygen itself. One sunny afternoon, which already felt suspicious because Seattle normally behaves like a permanently sad poet, I took Lily grocery shopping while Daniel worked late. Grocery stores in America are psychologically exhausting enough without children involved. The carts are enormous. The cereal aisle looks like capitalism having a nervous breakdown. And somehow every cashier asks conversational questions while scanning your vegetables at Olympic speed. Lily sat inside the cart singing loudly about dinosaurs while I searched for yogurt. Suddenly a cheerful older employee approached us smiling warmly. "Oh my goodness," she said to Lily, "you are adorable." Very normal interaction. Simple. Harmless. Unfortunately, my exhausted brain misunderstood adorable as adoptable. So naturally, I panicked completely and answered, "No thank you, she's mine." Silence. The employee blinked twice. Lily stared at me. Then realization hit like emotional lightning. I wanted the floor to open immediately and swallow my entire bloodline. But the woman burst out laughing so hard she had to lean against the shopping cart for support. Soon I was laughing too, partly because it was funny and partly because embarrassment had already consumed my soul entirely. Lily repeated the story to Daniel later that night with the dramatic energy of someone exposing government secrets. For weeks afterward, Daniel introduced me jokingly as the woman who almost gave away our child at Safeway. Incredible reputation. But here is the strange thing. That moment no longer hurt. Years earlier, an English mistake in public would have destroyed my confidence for days. Now it became laughter shared between people who loved me. Emotional safety changes everything. Research about learning environments shows that people improve communication skills much faster when mistakes are treated as normal rather than shameful. Fear blocks experimentation. Laughter invites it. Around that time, I also started noticing something fascinating about Americans. Native speakers make communication mistakes constantly. They forget words, mishear phrases, use wrong expressions, interrupt each other accidentally. One night Daniel told a waiter he was emotionally medium rare instead of emotionally drained. Another time Lily proudly announced at school that her father cooked the smoke alarm instead of set off the smoke alarm. Human language is naturally chaotic. Fluency does not eliminate awkwardness. It simply makes people less afraid of surviving it. That realization became incredibly freeing. One evening, our family attended a neighborhood barbecue hosted by one of Daniel's coworkers. These events are secretly social endurance competitions disguised as casual fun. Americans gather around grilled meat discussing weather, mortgages, and local traffic with frightening enthusiasm while children sprint through yards like caffeinated raccoons. I was talking with a group of women about parenting when someone asked whether I enjoyed raising kids in the States. Perfectly normal question. Except my distracted brain heard raising goats in the States. Without hesitation, I answered very sincerely, no, we only have one child. The entire group exploded laughing while I stood there emotionally buffering in real time. One woman nearly dropped her lemonade. Honestly, the best part about living in America long enough is realizing people often appreciate effort more than perfection. Especially when humor is involved. Social psychologists found that shared laughter increases interpersonal trust because it signals emotional openness and reduced social threat. In simple words, laughing together makes humans feel safe together. That matters enormously for language learners. Many people avoid speaking English because they fear sounding foolish. But ironically, small mistakes often make conversations warmer, more memorable, and more human. Somewhere during those years, I stopped trying to sound flawless and started trying to sound real. Huge difference. Of course, not every misunderstanding became funny immediately. Some still triggered old insecurities. One afternoon at Lily's school, another parent complimented my English and added, "You barely even have an accent anymore." She meant it kindly. But unexpectedly, sadness hit me hard. Because accents carry history, family, memory, identity. Immigrants live in a strange emotional space where improving communication sometimes feels connected to losing pieces of home. Researchers studying bilingual identity describe this as cultural dissonance. The brain struggles balancing adaptation with self-preservation. Basically, part of you wants belonging while another part fears disappearing. That night I admitted those feelings to Daniel while we folded laundry together because apparently adulthood becomes deeply unglamorous after children. He listened quietly before saying something I still remember clearly. "Your accent tells the story of how hard you fought to build this life." That sentence changed the way I viewed myself forever. Suddenly my voice no longer sounded like evidence of failure. It sounded like evidence of survival. Lily accidentally reinforced that lesson a few weeks later. During bedtime, she asked why I spoke differently than some other moms. My heart tightened immediately. But before insecurity could fully arrive, she smiled and said, "I like it. You sound like home and adventure together." Honestly, Children sometimes deliver emotional wisdom adults spend thousands of dollars trying to learn in therapy. That night, after Lily fell asleep surrounded by stuffed animals and absolute bedtime chaos, I stood quietly in the kitchen watching rain streak down our windows again. Seattle never changes emotionally. Daniel wrapped his arms around me from behind while soft music played somewhere in the apartment. "You know," he whispered, "your English mistakes are probably half the reason I fell in love with you." I laughed immediately. "That's concerning." It grew through awkward pauses, wrong words, patience, listening, humor, vulnerability. Real things. Human things. Still, life has an annoying habit of testing happiness right after people finally relax. Because only a few months later, one painful misunderstanding late at night would force Daniel and me to confront a truth far more dangerous than broken grammar. The silent fight at midnight. The terrifying thing about relationships is that sometimes the biggest arguments are not actually about what people say out loud, but about the invisible fears hiding underneath the sentences, quietly poisoning everything while two exhausted humans stand in the kitchen pretending they are discussing dishes, schedules, or text messages instead of loneliness and insecurity. That night started so normally it almost feels unfair now. Seattle rain tapped softly against the apartment windows while Lily slept upstairs surrounded by stuffed animals and complete bedtime chaos. Daniel sat at the dining table answering emails from work while I folded laundry beside the couch watching some cooking show where attractive people somehow prepared 5-course meals without emotional breakdowns. Completely unrealistic television. Everything looked peaceful on the surface. Yet something heavy had been building quietly inside me for weeks. Maybe months. Tiny moments. Tiny comments. Tiny insecurities stacking on top of each other until my nervous system started carrying emotional weight I no longer understood how to explain. The problem with long-term insecurity is that it evolves. At first, my fear was obvious. I worried people would not understand my English. Later, after years in America, the fear became more complicated and harder to name. What if people understood me perfectly, and still preferred someone else easier? Faster? Simpler? Psychologists describe this as lingering identity insecurity. Even after external progress occurs, old emotional beliefs can continue operating silently in the background like outdated software ruining an otherwise functional computer. Earlier that evening, Daniel had laughed at a joke made by one of his female coworkers during a phone call. Completely harmless. Normal human interaction. Yet something irrational tightened painfully inside my chest. She spoke quickly. Confidently. Effortlessly American. And suddenly my brain started comparing again. Old fears woke up immediately like emotionally unstable ghosts. I tried ignoring the feeling. Tried acting normal. But emotional suppression works about as well as holding beach balls underwater. Eventually everything explodes upward. Around midnight Daniel noticed I had become strangely quiet. "You okay?" he asked softly without looking away from his laptop. Dangerous question. I answered the classic emotionally unhealthy phrase, "I'm fine." Every married person watching this video just felt stress enter their bloodstream immediately. Because nobody in human history has ever said "I'm fine" peacefully during a relationship conflict. Daniel looked at me carefully. "You don't seem fine." I shrugged while folding Lily's tiny pajamas aggressively enough to qualify as emotional violence. You probably have more interesting conversations with people at work anyway. Silence. The air changed instantly. Daniel closed his laptop slowly. What does that mean? He asked carefully. I wish I could say, I responded calmly and maturely. Absolutely not. Years of hidden insecurity suddenly spilled everywhere. I admitted feeling embarrassed sometimes during group conversations. I admitted feeling slower, less confident, less intelligent because English still exhausted me mentally after all these years. I admitted occasionally worrying Daniel might eventually become tired of translating parts of life emotionally for me. The words came out messy, emotional, tangled. Not because my English failed me, but because vulnerability is chaotic even in native languages. Daniel stared at me in complete shock. You seriously think I see you that way? He asked quietly. I crossed my arms immediately, which psychologists would probably describe as defensive body language and emotionally dramatic energy. You don't understand, I whispered. You've never had to rebuild yourself in another language. That sentence landed hard between us. Because it was true. But truth can still wound people. Daniel stood up suddenly and walked toward the kitchen window while rain streaked down the glass behind him. You know what hurts? He asked softly after a long silence. No matter how much I love you, you still think you're not enough. That sentence completely froze me. Because deep down, part of me knew he was right. Sometimes unresolved insecurity quietly rejects love before love ever gets the chance to fully arrive. Researchers studying attachment anxiety found that people with deep fears of inadequacy often misinterpret neutral situations as emotional threats. In simple words, the brain starts protecting itself from rejection so aggressively that it accidentally damages connection instead. That night, our argument was not truly about language anymore. It was about worth, identity, fear. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table feeling emotionally exhausted. I spent years trying not to sound stupid, I admitted quietly. Sometimes I still feel like I'm pretending to belong here. Daniel's expression softened immediately after that. Anger disappeared from his face almost instantly because beneath conflict, there was finally honesty. Real honesty. The dangerous, beautiful kind. He sat across from me while soft rain sounds filled the apartment. Can I tell you something? He asked gently. I nodded weakly. You think fluency means never struggling, he said. But everybody struggles to explain themselves sometimes. Even in their own language. He explained how Americans constantly misunderstand each other despite speaking English fluently. Couples fight over tone. Families misread intentions. Friends drift apart because nobody says what they actually mean. Communication problems are human problems, not immigrant problems. That realization hit me harder than expected. Because I had spent years treating my accent like the central flaw in every emotional difficulty. But maybe relationships were always messy. Maybe love had never depended on perfect wording. Neuroscience actually supports this idea strongly. Studies about emotional communication show that tone, facial expression, timing, and responsiveness carry enormous relational meaning beyond vocabulary itself. Human beings connect emotionally through far more than grammar. Yet insecurity narrows perspective until one weakness starts looking like the explanation for everything painful in life. I finally looked at Daniel and whispered the question I had secretly feared for years. Do you ever wish things were easier with someone else? The moment those words left my mouth, I regretted them instantly. Because sometimes fear asks questions love should never have to answer. Daniel stared at me for several seconds before walking closer slowly. Then he knelt beside my chair and held my hands gently. Easy? He repeated softly. You crossed an ocean alone. Learned another language. Built a life from nothing. Became an incredible mother. And you think I'm looking for easy? My throat tightened immediately. He continued quietly, I fell in love with you because every conversation with you felt real. Even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. Honestly, that sentence healed something inside me I did not realize was still broken. We sat there together for a long time afterward while Seattle rain softened outside and the apartment finally became quiet again. No dramatic movie ending. No magical disappearance of insecurity. Healing rarely works that way. But something important changed that night. For the first time, I fully understood that my fear of imperfect English had slowly transformed into fear of imperfect worthiness. And those are not the same thing at all. Before going upstairs to bed, Daniel kissed my forehead gently and whispered, You never had to earn your place in my life through perfect sentences. I almost cried immediately because sometimes the simplest words arrive exactly where years of insecurity have been hiding. Still, life was not finished teaching us difficult lessons yet. Because only a few weeks later, one unexpected moment involving Lily would force both of us to rethink what connection, identity, and family truly meant inside our strange, beautiful bilingual home. Learning love slowly. The strange thing about healing inside a relationship is that it rarely arrives through giant romantic gestures or dramatic speeches in the rain like movies promise. Most real healing happens quietly, in ordinary moments so small you almost miss them while living through them. A slower conversation. A softer answer. Someone choosing patience when frustration would be easier. After the argument Daniel and I had that night in the kitchen, something subtle changed between us. Not because all our insecurities magically disappeared. Absolutely not. We were still two exhausted adults raising a child, paying bills, surviving Seattle weather, and emotionally improvising our way through marriage like everyone else. But for the first time, we started paying closer attention to how we spoke to each other, especially when life became stressful. And honestly, that changed everything more than perfect communication ever could. A few weeks after our midnight fight, Lily came home from school unusually quiet. Parents instantly notice this kind of thing because children normally sound like tiny caffeinated radio stations broadcasting random thoughts about dinosaurs and crackers non-stop. Silence feels suspicious. During dinner she barely touched her food and kept twisting noodles around her fork dramatically like a stressed office worker contemplating taxes. Finally Daniel asked gently, Everything okay, Bug? Lily hesitated before mumbling, A boy at school said Mommy talks weird. The room became completely silent. It is fascinating how one sentence from a child can punch directly through years of emotional armor in under 3 seconds. My chest tightened immediately. Old insecurities woke up so fast it felt physical. Even after all those years, part of me still feared this moment. The moment my accent might become something embarrassing instead of beautiful inside my daughter's world. I forced a small smile and asked calmly, And what did you say? Lily shrugged. I said everybody talks different. Then she continued eating noodles like she had not just emotionally body-slammed both her parents. Children casually destroy and heal adults without even realizing it. That night after Lily went to bed, I sat quietly on the couch while rain tapped softly against the windows again because apparently Seattle refuses to experience any other weather. Emotion. Daniel sat beside me holding 2 mugs of tea. "You okay?" he asked gently. I laughed weakly. "I thought I was." He understood immediately. That is one thing long relationships teach people. Sometimes the most loving act is recognizing pain before someone fully explains it. I admitted that Lily's comment reopened fears I thought I had finally overcome. Not because of the child at school specifically, but because part of me still worried my daughter would eventually become ashamed of the parts of me that sounded different from everyone else around her. Daniel listened quietly before asking something unexpected. "Do you know why Lily feels secure enough to defend you already?" I shook my head. "Because she learned confidence from watching you survive uncomfortable things without hiding." Honestly, that sentence stunned me. Because I had never viewed my struggles that way before. I saw awkward conversations, mistakes, anxiety. But children often interpret their parents differently. Psychologists studying resilience found that kids develop emotional strength not from seeing perfect adults, but from watching adults face difficulty without completely collapsing emotionally. In simple words, children learn courage by observing imperfect people continue anyway. The next morning, while making breakfast before school, something small happened that I will probably remember forever. Lily sat at the kitchen table drawing with crayons while I packed her lunch. Suddenly she looked up and asked, "Mommy, can you teach me how to say I love you in your language again?" My entire heart melted immediately. So I taught her slowly while she repeated the words with adorable terrible pronunciation. She laughed after every attempt. Then she hugged me tightly and whispered, "I like your words." Sometimes healing enters people through tiny ordinary moments instead of grand emotional revelations. Around that time, Daniel and I also started changing how we communicated during difficult conversations. Before, both of us often rushed emotionally. We interrupted, assumed meanings, reacted defensively. But after years of misunderstandings, we slowly learned something powerful. Slower conversations create safer relationships. Neuroscience explains this beautifully. When people feel emotionally threatened during arguments, the brain activates defensive survival systems that reduce listening ability and increase reactive behavior. Basically, once your nervous system feels attacked, your brain stops hearing clearly and starts preparing emotional weapons. Not ideal for marriage. So Daniel and I created small habits together. We spoke more slowly during conflicts. We repeated important feelings instead of assuming understanding. Sometimes we paused conversations completely when emotions became too loud. It felt awkward at first, honestly. Like 2 emotionally exhausted penguins attending couples therapy on a frozen iceberg. But gradually our home became calmer. Softer somehow. One rainy Sunday afternoon, while Lily built blanket forts in the living room and dramatically declared herself queen of the couch kingdom, Daniel asked me something surprising. "Do you remember the first time we met?" I laughed immediately. "At the bus stop?" I was soaked and emotionally unstable. "You also kept apologizing for your English every 5 minutes, he teased gently. I groaned dramatically because unfortunately he was correct. Then he smiled and said something that stayed with me deeply. "You know what's funny? Your English is much better now, but that's not why our relationship became stronger." I looked at him curiously. "Then why?" He leaned back against the couch while rain blurred the Seattle skyline outside our apartment window. Because we stopped trying to sound impressive and started trying to understand each other. That sentence felt simple. Yet honestly, it explained almost everything. Many people think communication means speaking perfectly. But real communication often means listening carefully enough to hear the fear, hope, exhaustion, or love hidden underneath imperfect words. Language matters, of course. But emotional attention matters more. Studies about successful long-term relationships consistently show that emotional responsiveness predicts connection better than conversational. Sophistication. Humans do not need perfect speeches nearly as much as they need to feel emotionally safe while speaking imperfectly. That realization slowly transformed not only our marriage but my relationship with English itself. I stopped viewing conversations as opportunities to prove intelligence. Instead, I started seeing them as opportunities to build closeness. Huge difference. My fluency improved naturally afterward, ironically enough. Fear had finally loosened its grip on my nervous system. One evening, while putting Lily to bed, she looked sleepily at both of us and asked, "How did you and Daddy fall in love if Mommy was still learning English?" Daniel smiled immediately. I laughed softly, pulling blankets around her tiny shoulders. Then he answered before I could. Because love listens differently. Lily nodded seriously like a tiny philosopher trapped inside children's pajamas. But after she fell asleep and we quietly closed her bedroom door, I realized something emotional. Maybe the real reason our relationship survived was never because we communicated perfectly. Maybe it survived because we kept choosing each other even when communication became difficult. Still, life was preparing one final lesson for our family. Because not long after that conversation, an unexpected moment during a community event in Seattle would force me to confront the biggest question I had avoided since arriving in America years earlier: where did I truly belong now? Where do I belong now? The weirdest part about building a life in another country is that one day you suddenly realize you no longer fit perfectly anywhere, and honestly, nobody prepares immigrants for that emotional plot twist. People imagine identity like a stable object. Simple. Fixed. Permanent. But after enough years living between languages, cultures, habits, and memories, your sense of home starts behaving more like wet soap emotionally slipping around inside your hands. That realization hit me unexpectedly during a community event at Lily's elementary school on one unusually sunny Seattle afternoon. Which already felt suspicious because sunshine in Seattle makes everyone behave like they escaped prison. Parents crowded the school playground carrying coffee cups and folding chairs while children sprinted across the grass screaming with the energy level of tiny caffeinated wolves. Booths lined the schoolyard selling cupcakes, handmade crafts, books, and food from different cultures. Music floated through the warm air while teachers smiled like exhausted heroes surviving another academic year. Lily ran ahead wearing a paper crown she had decorated herself and immediately disappeared into the chaos because children apparently operate under the assumption that parental blood pressure is a fun group activity. Daniel squeezed my hand gently while we walked through the crowd. "You okay?" he asked softly. Funny how he still asked that question after all these years, like emotional maintenance was part of daily marriage hygiene. "Yeah," I answered honestly. And I meant it. Mostly. Yet something strange happened while moving through the event. Different parents stopped to talk with us. Some greeted Daniel warmly. Others complimented Lily. A few asked where I was originally from after hearing my accent. Normal conversations. Friendly conversations. But suddenly I noticed something uncomfortable hiding underneath them all. Every interaction placed me emotionally somewhere between visitor and belonging. Not fully outside. Not fully inside. Just floating in between like cultural Wi-Fi trying to reconnect. Researchers studying immigrant identity actually describe this experience as bicultural liminality. Which sounds very intellectual but basically means your brain exists awkwardly between worlds. You adapt enough to change, but not enough to completely erase where you came from. And honestly, that emotional middle space can become incredibly lonely sometimes. Around noon, Lily dragged us excitedly toward a classroom where students displayed family projects about heritage and traditions. Children's school projects are fascinating because they accidentally expose entire family identities using glue sticks and questionable handwriting. Lily's project board contained photos of our family cooking together, celebrating holidays, visiting the Seattle waterfront, and speaking both languages at home. At the center she had written one sentence in giant colorful letters: "My family comes from different places but lives in the same heart." I nearly started crying immediately in front of second-grade art projects. Very emotionally professional behavior. Daniel wrapped an arm around my shoulders quietly while I stared at Lily's board. Because somehow our daughter had explained belonging more clearly than I ever could. Still, the emotional confusion inside me did not disappear completely. Later that afternoon, another mother asked whether we planned to stay in America permanently. Such a simple question. Yet my brain froze unexpectedly. Permanently. The word echoed strangely inside me. Because despite years of marriage, motherhood, work, friendships, and life in Seattle, part of me still mentally described America as temporary sometimes. Not intentionally. More like emotional habit. Immigrants often carry invisible exit signs inside themselves long after building roots. Trauma researchers explain this through survival psychology. When people experience major displacement or uncertainty, the brain resists full attachment as a form of self-protection. In simple words, your nervous system stays half-packed emotionally just in case life suddenly changes again. That evening after the event, Daniel and I walked slowly through a nearby park while Lily chased pigeons with chaotic determination. The sky glowed soft orange above Seattle buildings while cold wind carried the smell of rain and pine trees through the air. Beautiful. Quiet. The kind of moment that sneaks into your memory forever without asking permission. I finally admitted something to Daniel I had never fully said aloud before. "Sometimes I feel guilty," I whispered. He looked at me carefully. "About what?" I hesitated. "About changing." The sentence surprised even me. But once it existed, more words followed naturally. I explained how strange it felt speaking English every day, raising an American daughter, celebrating new traditions, adapting to new habits. Laughing at jokes that once made no sense. Part of me loved this life deeply. Another part worried I was slowly drifting away from who I used to be. Identity is complicated that way. Human beings want growth and continuity simultaneously, which is emotionally impossible sometimes. Daniel listened quietly while Lily continued terrorizing pigeons in the background like a tiny supervillain. Finally he smiled softly and asked, "Do you think becoming more than one thing means losing the first thing?" That question stayed suspended between us while wind moved through the trees. Because honestly, I had never considered identity that way before. Psychologists studying multicultural identity found that emotionally healthy adaptation often happens not through replacing old identities, but expanding them. The brain can hold multiple cultural attachments simultaneously without betrayal occurring. In simple words, becoming connected to a new place does not erase love for the old one. Yet emotionally, many immigrants still struggle with that guilt. Especially women. Especially mothers. Because culture travels through daily life. Through food, language, traditions, bedtime stories, humor, habits. We worry constantly about what survives and what disappears. Later that night, after Lily fell asleep curled around stuffed animals and complete bedtime nonsense, I sat quietly beside the kitchen window watching Seattle rain begin again because the city apparently sensed emotional vulnerability approaching. Daniel made tea while soft jazz played in the background. Ordinary moment. Yet something inside me felt unsettled. "Can I ask you something weird?" I said quietly. He smiled. "You married me. Weird questions are expected now." I laughed softly before asking the question that had silently followed me for years. "When people look at me here, do you think they see me as American?" Daniel thought carefully before answering. Then he said something so simple and honest it completely changed how I viewed myself. "I think they see someone brave enough to build a home twice." That sentence hit me harder than almost anything he had ever said. Because suddenly my life stopped looking divided and started looking expanded. Maybe belonging was never about choosing one identity over another. Maybe belonging meant carrying different versions of yourself honestly without apologizing for any of them. Neuroscience even supports this emotionally. The brain continuously reshapes identity through experience and connection. Human beings are not fixed objects. We are living stories adapting in real time. That realization softened something deep inside me. For years I believed fluency would finally make me feel complete. But now I understood something much more important. Home was never hiding inside perfect English. Home was sitting beside me drinking tea while rain touched the windows and our daughter slept safely upstairs. Home was love surviving awkward conversations, exhaustion, fear, parenting, cultural confusion, and time itself. Still, one final moment remained before I fully understood how far our strange beautiful journey had truly come. Because the next morning, Lily would say something unexpectedly simple at breakfast that would bring our entire story full circle in a way neither Daniel nor I could have predicted. Love never needed perfect English. The funny thing about life is that sometimes the answer to the biggest question you have carried for years arrives while somebody is pouring cereal at 8 in the morning wearing dinosaur pajamas and accidentally dropping milk on the kitchen floor. No dramatic music. No life-changing speech on top of a mountain. Just ordinary chaos inside an ordinary home. The morning after Daniel and I talked about belonging, Seattle woke up wrapped in soft gray clouds again while rain whispered against the windows like background music that never learned when to stop. I stood in the kitchen making breakfast half awake, emotionally reflective, and deeply betrayed by how early children naturally wake up on weekends. Lily sat at the table drawing tiny hearts on napkins while Daniel searched for coffee with the desperation of a man reconnecting with civilization. Everything felt peaceful in that messy family way real happiness often does. Not glamorous. Not perfect. Just warm. Then Lily suddenly looked up from her drawing and asked the kind of question children throw into conversations without realizing they are emotionally dismantling adults before breakfast. "Mommy," she said carefully, "when did you stop being scared to talk?" I froze slightly while holding a spoon over scrambled eggs. Because honestly, I did not know exactly when it happened. Fear disappeared so slowly I barely noticed it leaving. Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter watching me curiously while I searched for an answer. "I don't think I stopped being scared all at once," I admitted softly. "I think I just kept talking anyway." Lily nodded thoughtfully like a tiny philosopher trapped inside cartoon pajamas. Then she smiled and said something so simple it completely broke my heart in the best possible way. "I'm glad you didn't stop." That was it. Tiny sentence. Tiny moment. Yet suddenly memories flooded through me all at once. Standing alone at that rainy Seattle bus stop years earlier, terrified to speak incorrectly. Crying in my apartment after humiliating mistakes. Repeating English phrases into mirrors. Feeling smaller every time my brain froze during conversations. Believing fluency was the same thing as worthiness. Believing love required perfection. And somehow, despite all that fear, life kept moving forward anyway. That realization hit me deeply because most people imagine transformation as one giant breakthrough moment. But real growth rarely works that way. Neuroscientists studying habit formation and emotional resilience found that lasting personal change usually happens through repeated small actions, rather than dramatic overnight shifts. In simple words, humans become different slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. Looking back now, I realized my English improved the most during moments when I stopped trying to sound impressive and simply focused on connection instead. Reading bedtime stories to Lily. Laughing with Daniel late at night. Comforting customers at work. Calling my parents back home while crying during hard seasons. Language became stronger once emotion became more important than performance. And honestly, maybe that lesson applies to much more than English. After breakfast, Daniel suggested we take a family walk before the rain became heavier. Seattle people treat temporary dry weather like a national emergency requiring immediate outdoor activity. So we bundled into jackets and walked slowly through our neighborhood while cold wind moved through the trees and coffee shops filled with sleepy people carrying laptops and unresolved emotional issues. Typical Seattle atmosphere. Lily skipped ahead collecting colorful leaves while Daniel held my hand quietly. At one point we passed the same bus stop where we first met years earlier. The exact place. Same street. Same gray sky. Same smell of rain and traffic and coffee drifting through the air. I stopped walking immediately. Daniel noticed my expression and smiled softly. "You okay?" he asked. I laughed quietly. I was so scared here. He squeezed my hand gently. "I know." For a moment, we simply stood there together watching buses move through wet streets while memories drifted through my mind. I remembered apologizing constantly for my broken English that night. I remembered believing nobody could truly know me until I sounded perfect. Yet somehow, standing there now beside my husband while our daughter chased pigeons nearby with complete emotional commitment, I finally understood something important. Love had never been waiting for my perfect English. Life had never been paused until flawless grammar arrived. Connection started the moment I allowed myself to participate imperfectly instead of hiding perfectly. Researchers studying vulnerability and relationships found that emotional openness consistently predicts stronger human connection than polished self-presentation. Basically, people bond more deeply through sincerity than performance. Which honestly feels unfair after how much time humans spend trying to appear impressive. Daniel interrupted my thoughts gently. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. I nodded. "That first night at the bus stop, I barely noticed your mistakes." I stared at him suspiciously. "That's scientifically impossible." He laughed immediately. "No, seriously. I noticed how hard you were trying to connect. That mattered more." We kept walking slowly afterward while Lily narrated completely imaginary adventures involving squirrels and magical kingdoms because children live inside beautiful chaos constantly. And somewhere during that walk, I realized something healing. For years I had treated my accent like evidence of incompleteness. But maybe my voice had always carried proof of courage instead. Every awkward conversation. Every embarrassing mistake. Every misunderstood phrase. Every moment I continued speaking despite fear. None of it meant failure. It meant survival. It meant growth. It meant I kept choosing connection even when insecurity begged me to disappear. That matters. Especially now. Because somewhere out there, somebody watching this video is probably sitting alone feeling exactly the way I once felt. Exhausted by English. Embarrassed by mistakes. Convinced fluency must arrive before confidence, friendship, love, opportunity, or belonging can begin. But honestly, human beings were never designed to connect perfectly. Native speakers misunderstand each other constantly. Couples fight. Friends miscommunicate. Parents struggle explaining emotions to children. Language has always been messy because people are messy. Yet love still happens. Families still form. Life still moves forward. Imperfectly. Beautifully. That evening, after Lily fell asleep and Seattle rain returned again like an emotionally committed background character, Daniel and I sat together on the couch holding tea while soft music played quietly through the apartment. I rested my head against his shoulder and whispered something I never imagined saying years earlier. "I think I finally feel at home." Daniel kissed the top of my head gently before answering with the sentence that somehow completed our entire story perfectly. "Good," he whispered. "Because you always were." And maybe that is the real truth nobody tells language learners enough. You do not need perfect English to deserve connection. You do not need flawless grammar to deserve love. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is speak imperfectly and stay anyway. Because in the end, people rarely remember every word you said correctly. They remember how safe they felt trying to understand you. Sometimes the most beautiful relationships are not built with perfect grammar, perfect timing, or perfect people. They are built with patience, courage, late-night conversations, awkward mistakes, and two hearts willing to stay even when communication feels hard. Maybe that's why this story matters more than just English practice. Because deep down, many people are not only afraid of speaking English. They are afraid of being misunderstood, rejected, or not enough. But here's the truth nobody says loudly enough in 2026. You do not need perfect English to start a new life, build real love, make friends, raise a family, or belong somewhere in this world. You only need the courage to keep speaking, even when your voice shakes. And maybe, while you are learning English slowly, life is also quietly teaching you confidence, healing, and connection at the same time. So the next time you feel embarrassed making mistakes, remember this: every fluent speaker was once confused too. Every strong person was once afraid too. And every beautiful story begins with someone brave enough to continue before feeling fully ready. If this story touched your heart, helped your English listening skills, or reminded you not to give up on yourself, please subscribe to the channel. Like this video, and leave a comment sharing where you are learning English from and what dream you are still fighting for. Your story might encourage someone else who feels alone tonight. And stay until the next video, because the next story may feel even more personal, emotional, and life-changing than this one. Sometimes one simple English story can quietly change the way you see your entire life.